My name is Zach Edwards. I'm a senior threat analyst at Silent Push. And today I'm going to be talking about a group of threat actors known as Raspberry Robin. And they're some of my favorite threat actors. That's why I'm giving this presentation. They're initial access brokers who've been around for a couple of years. And what's super interesting about them, I'm going to go through how we've pieced together different aspects of their infrastructure based on various security companies' public reporting. And Raspberry Robin there was a takedown, a partial takedown last year, and they've evolved several times as defenders have sort of learned their methods. Why I think it's particularly important for people to be understanding who Raspberry Robin is and why I'm giving this presentation is because they are initial access brokers for some of the most serious threat actors out there. And as I go through some of the people that are potentially associated with them, I want everyone to appreciate that we know of many attacks that their, quote, partners have successfully done over the last couple of years. And we know Raspberry Robin is an initial access broker for them. It's very possible that certain organizations impacted by Raspberry Robin didn't publicly note that they were the initial access, and we may have less visibility about what they're actually doing. And finally, what I'll be going through is some really cool Netflow and our research into how we sort of backed into that Netflow and some of our thoughts about this takedown process that we hope to encourage. So I'm also going to be talking about some of their Fast Flux infrastructure. So Raspberry Robin is very interesting because they are basically registering domains, and then the A-record IP addresses that are mapped to those domains, they're associated with compromised devices. So if you track the domains that they're registering and using and tracking basically the DNS changes on those domains, you are capturing lists of compromised devices. And so I'll be going through some additional details about what that means and why it's interesting to track that infrastructure. One of the core parts that I'll be discussing is collaboration. So throughout this whole presentation, I'm not only going to be citing these third-party sources that have put out some really good research, but I'm basically going to be highlighting how all different organizations who have researched Raspberry Robin have different visibility. And it's a very interesting threat actor because of all the obfuscation they're doing, but also some of the methods that they're using to obfuscate their work is very sophisticated. And we'll also get into some of their in-day payloads and a variety of sort of what their attacks look like. One of the most important things that I really want to highlight here is collaboration is key, because no one would be able to track Raspberry Robin if it wasn't for some of the original research into their malware. And this threat actor group is still around after several years. And based on conversations I've had with some folks who have different visibility into this, they are absolutely still a threat. And so we need anyone with even a little bit of visibility into a Raspberry Robin attack, sharing that to law enforcement, and also publicizing anything you can. So what's interesting about Raspberry Robin, that one of their aliases is Rostiak, or the QNAP worm. And they basically were first sort of talked about by Red Canary. And Red Canaries were the ones who named it Raspberry Robin. And their research is one of the most definitive pieces behind how we know what Raspberry Robin is, the malware that they're using, and how they're spreading across the world, basically. And in 2022, Microsoft also basically started to put out information about it and started to get basically pretty serious visibility into how many organizations were impacted. 1,000 organizations have seen at least one Raspberry Robin payload. And around 2022, for those first couple of years when this was sort of first being talked about, it was a bigger threat. And so I don't want anyone to think that we're seeing exactly the same type of attack payload here in 2024, but we absolutely are still seeing attacks right now. This has not gone away. I'll explain in a little bit about the takedown that took place and then what they've changed since that takedown. And it's important to also appreciate that Microsoft claims that this has actually been going on since 2019. So what's kind of scary about this threat is they were operating so in the dark that no cybersecurity research company spoke about them for the first couple of years. They were basically a ghost, a malware that wasn't being identified as behind some big campaign. And Avast also put out some information when all this was going down, basically helping people to appreciate that 500,000 of their users were protected by this, from this worm. And you can imagine if they protected 500,000, people who didn't have Avast were likely compromised. And one of the very interesting things about Raspberry Robin, and I've recently had some conversations with some folks about this, their initial compromises. So they were compromising copy stores, print stores, places where you go to print up some project. And basically, as soon as you stuck your USB drive into one of those print machines that was compromised, the malware was deployed into your USB drive. And then when you took that USB drive to another computer, that computer would be infected, and future USB drives that you used from that computer would spread it. And so organizations were basically having maybe 1 or 2 people within their organization go to a copy shop, maybe bring it into their atmosphere, their environment, and then it would just start spreading. I heard of sort of stories of consultants who were passing around USB drives that were having issues with it. And what's also interesting about this malware from the copy stores, to my knowledge, nothing has been shown publicly. We've never seen the malware that was deployed onto those copy machines. Now, we have seen the malware that was copied onto those USB drives and was basically brought onto computer environments. But to my knowledge, the actual mirrored sort of drives from those copy stores was never made public. But I do know, based on conversations, that some organizations do have this malware. They have quite a few samples of it. But for whatever reason, some of this was not made public. And in 2023, the QNAP devices were basically, it was first sort of appreciated how some of this was spreading. So Sequoia put out a really interesting post about the fact that Raspberry Robin was using QNAP instances, and they were one of the first to basically map some of those DNS resolutions. So this basically is some of the methods that we use at Silent Push, so the company that I work at. We saw this research that was coming out. We realized that with our efforts, we scan and monitor the internet for DNS changes. This was a perfect opportunity for us to start tracking a pretty serious threat actor and try and basically find the domains they were using so that we could map the compromised devices that are part of that infrastructure. So basically hunting for what is a QNAP or an IoT compromised device that's part of their C2 network. There was some initial research about domains they were using, and we have a few examples here. So they're basically 2 or 3 character domains on very uncommon TLDs. And the domains basically have this Fast Flux rotation where every couple of days to every couple of weeks, they are rotating from one compromised device to another. And so by monitoring the domains they're using, we're able to get a list of the compromised IPs. And I'll show here in a little bit, once you have lists of compromised IPs, you can get Netflow data, you can start backing into who may actually be behind this. So we got some pretty cool information to share here in a little bit. Raspberry Robin has been targeting basically a spray and pray type of situation where it's lots of different industries. The fact that they started in copy stores kind of gives you that indication that they were really just trying to get a watering hole and get as many people impacted as possible. And what's kind of interesting about some of those early victims, not a ton of them are in the United States. And so this is definitely a threat that had required physical proximity to some of those copy stores. I heard that one of the original one, or an early one, was in the Philippines. There was certain places that this was sort of a bigger problem. And it was definitely one of those situations where in 2022 and 2023, lots of organizations were starting to get their understanding of what actually this was. And so IBM, for instance, told us that 17% of their clients in specific industries were seeing impacts from this in 2022. And so these are pretty significant numbers. And what I think is interesting about Raspberry Robin is some of these organizations that really put out this research in 2022, they did it because everyone was talking about it. Because Red Canary put out a fantastic post and everyone was like, oh, I've seen this, my network has seen this. And so they put out these really interesting reports on how exactly they saw in their endpoint detections, the exact types of clients. And we've only seen a little bit of that since. There haven't been as many public reports about it. They've also, since the 22 sort of initial campaigns, they've been evolving their attack methodology. So they initially were doing these bad USB campaigns. And a bad USB campaign where it basically would have a specific Windows shortcut file disguised as a folder. You click on it, it basically deploys the malicious payloads. It was sophisticated enough to work. And they basically, when they were doing this, they were also using Tor exit nodes for some of the C2s. So immediately, even when they were first being talked about, they were using Tor. And I'm going to get into more. They're using Tor even more right now. And the process basically that other folks have been figuring out about how they use Tor and why they're using it, they basically have some hard-coded .onion domains, and they're basically just checking to see if they can resolve those from a compromised device. And that process has changed slightly because of some changes in the Onion protocols, but basically since they've launched, they've been using Tor as part of their communication and C2 orchestration process. They've now, in 2024, they've sort of shifted away from bad USB attacks. So bad USB attacks, everyone knows, are a little hard to spread, kind of murky. Throwing USB drives in a parking lot is only going to work so many times. And so they've basically shifted to classic malware delivery mechanisms where they are using Discord, they're putting malicious content on there, and basically trying to get people to open these malicious files in various spam campaigns. There's details about the 2024 attacks, which I think are incredibly interesting because not many email security vendors have followed up with their own Raspberry Robin research into this. We know that they're doing this. We can see that they have compromised devices, and there's various organizations that are indicating Raspberry Robin is still an active initial access broker, but we don't have complete visibility into the types of phishing messages that they're sending out with some of their payloads. So hoping that folks that are watching this maybe can argue for putting out more research if they do have that visibility. And one of the other sort of really interesting parts about how Raspberry Robin works is just literally the malware that they use, Roystiak, and I'll get into it a little bit later, but some of the ways that they've basically packed this and are obfuscating their payload are very similar to another threat actor. And so there have been some indications or some research based on how they're actually structuring this malware to try and associate it to other known threat actors. And the research into this, I would strongly recommend anyone who's a malware reverse engineer. The Raspberry Robin obfuscation is some of the most interesting out there. It has, like it says, as many as 14 protective layers. There are numerous features behind it to try and prevent analysts from getting their hands on the actual malware. And I can say from experience, we recently got a 2024 sample of Raspberry Robin malware that ended up not being able, it didn't have all of the payloads embedded into it. And basically, because we weren't able to dynamically trigger all of the things that were needed, we basically had an incomplete copy of some Raspberry Robin malware. And if you look into other malware reverse engineers, that's been a common refrain is Some folks have been able to unpack this all the way down and get a lot of core raw details, and then other times various payloads just have not been able to be completely exposed. And some of the payloads that they've been doing are also associated with sort of adware, these drive-by download, low-quality type of attacks that a variety of other threat actors are trying. And Raspberry Robin is an initial access broker for some of those same drive-by download threat actors. And so it's interesting that they were sort of playing in this area, or they were alleged to a couple of years ago. And we've basically seen since 2024, HP put out a really interesting report about them using Windows script files. And this would also be sort of, obviously not a bad USB attack, and this is them moving to web-based attacks where they're trying to expand with how many people are compromised by Raspberry Robin and are moving into all of the normal ways that various threat actors are doing this, but with their own sort of spin on it, where everything they do is just a little bit different. And these Windows script files are basically downloaded, and it basically, if you execute these script files, you will then start to get additional follow-on payloads. And I'm going to go through it here in a second, but what's kind of scary about a Raspberry Robin attack, if you execute their malware, literally within seconds, you may have a follow-on attack from a totally separate, quote, threat actor because they were acting as an initial access broker for them. And so there have been sort of reports about these follow-on attacks, and it's possible that some people that have been impacted by Raspberry Robin through things like their more recent Windows script file just didn't associate it with Raspberry Robin, and instead the follow-on payload is what they sort of tracked. They also have been using basically one-day or in-day payloads, and this highlights their connections to the underground economy. They are obviously buying access to these. Their efforts with being an initial access broker, they clearly have many relationships with a variety of Russian-aligned threat actors and other just cybercrime threat actors. And the fact that they're basically able to buy these one-day exploits and deploy them against various appliances, QNAP devices, it really speaks to them being one of the few sort of cyber criminals that are doing this. Everyone should be hopefully aware of various orb networks. There's a lot of Chinese threat actors that are compromising routers and various IoT devices to set up sort of router networks or rather proxy networks to hide your traffic. Raspberry Robin is buying these exploits and basically building their own network for the trafficking of these malicious payloads. And so what's interesting about how a Raspberry Robin is different from an orb network, where Raspberry Robin isn't necessarily renting out that space, they are renting out the, quote, criminal opportunities that they present. And so when they pop some network or when they're targeting someone, they may have some sort of effort to sell specific networks to specific brokers. It's not exactly clear how they're choosing who to partner with as an initial access broker. But like I said, we do know that they are buying these from specific developers, and it's the main sort of thing to keep in mind is that these are basically built for targeting any type of system. And the fact that they are targeting sort of QNAP devices and IoT devices it shouldn't basically make anyone feel good about that. They are potentially going to continue this where it won't just be QNAP devices in the future. It will be anything connected to a network that they think they can get their payload on and start to funnel traffic through it. And so I think it's really important for everyone just to appreciate what this means when a threat actor can easily buy in-day payloads and then actively uses them successfully. And so in 2024, we got some details about one of these domains. And this is also one of the ways that we've been able to pivot into the current research that we have right now. So by knowing that basically they were using these two-letter domains, three-letter domains, and appreciating sort of how this was part of their C2 infrastructure, we've been able to sort of understand what we would need to do to track these folks. So now we're starting to get into some of the more nuts and bolts of how we actually track them. So again, dark trace flag that they were compromising these QNAP instances, and it's relatively easy when you navigate to one of these. Many of them have login pages. They have specific settings so that if you're scanning the internet, you can oftentimes get pretty consistent details about these QNAP devices, so you can easily say, this IP is a QNAP, this IP is a QNAP, this IP is a QNAP. And so it is important to appreciate that many of them have that raw login page on the IP address. And the other thing that's important to appreciate is what actually is happening with these domains and how they're actually being used. So the compromised device basically calls out to these endpoints with an unusual user agent Windows installer. So this is relatively new, 2024. There's been almost no follow-on from other endpoint detection companies about what they've seen from this user agent Windows installer. And so it's very, we have a limited view in terms of how much of this is going on right now in 2024. But based on a variety of sources, it does still seem to be a problem. Here's how we're hunting some of this. So this is, and some people may be surprised for us to be sharing our actual hunting queries. We don't think they're going to actually change their behavior. We believe that some of the things that they're doing, they just keep doing them even after researchers have spoken about them. And they've made such subtle changes with what they've done with these domains and how they're mapping them to their compromised devices that we're comfortable with this being public. And they basically, for quite a while when they first started, they were using the Jala name servers. And then they eventually shifted away from that completely. 2024, it's all Cloud NS. And most of the hosts you can find, if you are looking up for IP diversity over 5 or an ASN diversity over 5. And so just to simplify what that means, when you're looking at one of their domains, you should see 5 IP addresses or more, and those IPs should be hosted across 5 unique ASNs or more. They are not grouping domains by location. They have a pretty chaotic process, and so it gets you a really nice fingerprint if you're using any processes that allow you to sort of filter by that diversity. And you can see we basically are tracking, we were tracking one of their domains, and how we sort of knew about this shift, we literally saw the name server shifts. So at Silent Push, we're basically scanning the internet billions of times a day, and we're able to pick up changes like this. And so this is part of the root of how we are backing into who we think may be behind this. So here's one of their domains, and you can see this is sort of what their classic Fast Flux looks like, where on some of these IPs, this thin little line there, that's only one single day. And so for some of these IPs, they're only on there for a day. Some other ones, they're on there for a week, more than a week. It's odd how it's a little bit chaotic. We don't have any sort of clarity about why it looks like that, but it is sort of a common pattern where some of these IPs rotate really quickly. It could be because they're getting cleaned up or some other purpose, and then some others, they'll just leave it hanging there for a week or two. As you're basically scanning using that query, so if you're looking up sort of on the name servers that we've flagged there and on that IPAS diversity, you will find some false positives. So what we suggest doing is do that initial query, get the pool of domains, and then you're going to want to look at what the IPs are that are hosting there and you will basically be able to see the QNAP boxes. As I mentioned, they're pretty noisy in how they respond, from HTML titles to various other details. And in this instance, the SSL certificate also mentions QNAP. And so we think that on most platforms, folks can do this. Ours, obviously, is built for this type of scanning as well. And then I'm going to go through just a little bit more about what the infrastructure they have right now. And I'm going to share some pretty cool Netflow here in just a second. So this is a breakdown of the domains that they have right now. It's basically 23 of the lowest quality domains you can possibly get. A lot of these are really cheap. So they're buying really cheap domains. And because they're choosing weird TLDs, that's also how they're able to register these two-letter and three-letter domains. Whereas if they're registering .coms, most of your two-letter domain .coms have been taken for many years. And the other really cool thing is, maybe not cool, but last year they were on mostly Namecheap. And the disruption, and I'll briefly show this here on a slide in a moment, the disruption occurred because there was a giant request for Namecheap to basically implode 60 domains or so. So those were imploded, it disrupted their network for some short period of time, and then they immediately spun it back up and are using a whole bunch of other infrastructure now. So this is some of the AS ranges that they're using, and then here's the registrars. So from Namecheap, now they're using a whole bunch of other sort of lower quality registrars. Some have quite bad reputations. Others are just big registrars that maybe have missed this. But you can see they went from having all of their eggs in one Namecheap basket to a big diversity here with what they're doing with how they register the domains. And like I mentioned, most of the domains are currently on a cloud name server, cloudns.net, and that is basically a Bulgarian host. But they do have some other name servers that they're using. And what's sort of important to appreciate is that it's about as close to a bulletproof host as you can get. Yeah, I'm not sure if they're going to take actions on this one. It certainly doesn't appear like they're attempting to do any disruptions on their end. Here are some of the domains that they're using. Like I said, I don't think they're going to change this. So we're out here publicly explaining what they're doing right now. You can look at these domains. You can, with your DNS provider of choice, see the IPs that are mapped to it. And those IPs are compromised devices. And we think it's important for law enforcement and people in government to appreciate that this is basically a list of compromised devices. So we live in a world where there's been, I think, two instances where the FBI has basically commandeered routers, removed malware off of them, and remediated them. This is absolutely an example of a long-term threat that is compromising routers or these IoT devices. And there's a quite easy way for people to find these, to find the devices that are impacted, but there hasn't been a disruption like we've seen with other sort of router cleanup efforts. Now here's where we get into some of the fun Netflow. So Sequoia, great company, they put out some Netflow in 2023 with Team Cymru, and they basically had quite a complex flow between the C2s and the compromised devices, a bunch of virtual private servers, and there was basically this, let's just say a port 20,000 was one of the ways that they were contacting them. And it was complicated the way they'd structured this, but in theory, there were still takedown opportunities here. After this sort of analysis came out, they shifted some of their behaviors. For whatever reason, some part of this, they didn't like that security researchers had flagged this. They may have been worried about some part of their OPSEC, because they basically switched to a new architecture. So this is what the current Netflow of Raspberry Robin looks like. And again, this is from Team Cymru, who we partnered with on this effort. And what we basically found was we have the victim devices, we have the known QNAP devices, and all of the traffic from the current QNAP devices that are compromised are communicating through a specific IP address and a specific service. And from that service, the threat actors are using Tor to communicate and command all of those basically compromised devices. So we know there's currently one point of failure in Raspberry Robin right now. And while they're using Tor heavily, they've been using Tor for obfuscation for a number of years. This should be a reminder that when you're threat hunting and you have the domains that they're using, and then you can pivot into the IPs that they've compromised, if you can get that information to someone who has Netflow, you can get information about who is connecting to that compromised infrastructure on a regular basis, and then map exactly where the points of failure and takedown opportunities are. And so we're not basically exposing the exact IP address in this presentation because we shared it with law enforcement. And we think it's really important to appreciate that while we are explaining all of this, it is sort of going to be public that this has occurred. We believe that anything that Raspberry Robin does to change their sort of communication flow to these compromised QNAPs, if you have these same methodologies like we have, where you know how they're communicating, what they've compromised, and you can feed it to a good vendor, we should be able to take this down or at least have more disruptions than this sporadic name cheat thing that occurred. And so I just want to encourage everyone who's a researcher out there to appreciate that these types of opportunities exist. And when you do pull out the strings and you're able to get something like this, please don't keep it to yourself. Please give it to law enforcement and to people who can maybe actually take action and commandeer a server, do other things to it that would potentially give us intelligence. And basically all of the communicators to that specific IP address, you can see sort of here, everything is Tor. So this is a pretty strong evidence that they are not only using onion domains for various checks on compromised devices, they are heavily using Tor themselves to communicate with their infrastructure. And now we're basically going to go into a little bit of who they're doing the initial access brokering for. And so now that we know sort of what their infrastructure looks like, the fact that they're quite sophisticated, but they do have these points of failure, it's important to think about who are they working with and why should we take this down. So they have connections to Dev 0206, Evil Core, Fin11, Clop Gang, a variety of organizations that have some connection to Russian cybersecurity threat actors. And what's kind of peculiar about this is we only know about this because of third-party research from folks like Microsoft. They did a really good report on Raspberry Robin and some of the follow-on activities that they were seeing from it. And we need more cybersecurity companies with visibility into the follow-on payloads that are occurring from Raspberry Robin to talk about it, because that's who they're partnering with, that's who's paying them money, and we need to basically have people better understand that Raspberry Robin, if we take out Raspberry Robin, we reduce the likelihood of some of these follow-on activities and threats. And so there's also been sort of a really clear report from Sequoia that is saying that Raspberry Robin is a pay-per-install botnet. And seeing what Microsoft has put out and some of the other sort of details that I'm going to show here in just a moment, it is pretty clear that they are being paid for these infections. And SOC Golish is one of the more interesting follow-on instances. And so this is kind of a tough screenshot to read all the details, but it basically is, they had a Raspberry Robin infection, and within moments, a SOC Golish payload was being deployed. And this was a really clear and solid and public research from Deutsche Telekom, basically helping everyone to appreciate that Raspberry Robin is that initial access broker to threat groups or threats that are much better publicized and talked about. And so when people talk about a SOC Golish infection, they may be leaving off how that SOC Golish got onto devices in the first place. Raspberry Robin was connected by IBM to the Dridex malware loaders, and it was through basically a code analysis. And that's also particularly important. So anyone who has older versions of the Raspberry Robin malware, which they maybe didn't put out publicly, or any of the fresher stuff. We need that to be publicized, and if your team can't do the analysis, please just get that sample onto VirusTotal or another similar tool so that we can get some of this analysis, because some of these connections behind who we think Raspberry Robin may be working with or who they may be are because of very interesting code decisions that they've sort of made throughout their time in existence. And Lockbit is another one. So Lockbit is in the news all the time, and it basically it was connected to Raspberry Robin through a variety of the code families that they were using. And we all need to appreciate that these Russian cyber criminals, they work in big groups, big teams, and it would appear that these teams are not only collaborating, selling tools and services between each other, but sharing code as well. And so I just wanted to basically reiterate some of these details. Raspberry Robin is a very complex threat that no one cybersecurity company is really going to be able to take down. But by everyone talking about the visibility you have, sharing as much as you can publicly, it gives us more opportunities to potentially do a real takedown. So there was this 2022 takedown publicized in 2023 where basically dozens of domains that they had registered via Namecheap were deactivated. And this was, like I said, not a complete takedown. It moved about 30% of the domains they were using. And within months, they were basically back up on new registrars. It was a blip in their process. And we also know that now they're using far more registrars than they were back then. So they appear to have plans in place where if there were big domain takedowns as before, they will probably pivot just into a slight variation on it. And that's also why we basically put a lot of this research publicly in this presentation, because while we believe they will make minor changes, these long-term behaviors have been around for multiple years. So finally, some open questions. And one of the ones that just kept me up at night and why I want to do this presentation is the print and copy shop malware has never been made public. We don't have anyone from a Kinko's or some of these shops that says, like, here's exactly what the malware was in our device, here's the history of how we got it on there, and here's how we think it occurred. That's never actually happened. So their bad USB attacks have just kind of ghosted away, but I do know explicitly that some people do have copies of this malware. I spoke to someone today about it, and I really hope that more people who have copies of this because they had endpoints that were compromised considers putting this out into the world so that we can see the variations of the malware and how it's evolved, because we don't have enough samples of it. We know that the QNAP IoT devices are being compromised with in-day payloads, but we also don't have enough details from people who remediated those QNAP devices to give us a copy of what those looked like. There's potentially other details about what occurs on these QNAP devices once they're compromised that aren't public at the moment. So that is something that is an open question. Another one is, why was sock Golish sort of the first malicious payload that was injected through a host that was compromised by Raspberry Robin? What are the connections between sock Golish and Raspberry Robin? And how can we better appreciate the, quote, success of sock Golish while not talking about their partnerships with Raspberry Robin? And my hope is that more organizations who've been compromised by sock Golish or things that have been known to follow on from Raspberry Robin are looking into their logs, trying to confirm if Raspberry Robin was that initial access broker, and then making it public that that occurred. Because we can't hold them accountable for these crimes unless people are reporting them and making it clear that that's how that was occurring. Why did they shift from these bad USB attacks to all these new methods that they've been doing? Were some of those USB attacks unsuccessful? Some of the initial details in 2022 indicated they were pretty successful, but but there's not been a lot of details about defenses that have been taken other than malware signatures for those bad USBs. So why have they sort of shifted to this more common tactic of web-based delivery? And then, are they initial access broker? And what can we learn about how they're working? We don't have a whole lot of details about their payout structure. We don't know, to my knowledge, are they getting cuts of these ransomwares that they're supporting? Is it just some sort of flat service fee? And there's details about that that are important because they're working with various threat actors that have had plenty of successful ransomware attacks, make plenty of money. Are they being cut 5% into this, 10%? How much money do these Raspberry Robin threat actors have? And knowing that will give us some indication of how big is it. We really don't know how many people are in the Raspberry Robin threat group. And while it appears to be a classic team-based structure, there's a lot of details about how this actually operates that are quite murky. And then finally, how can we all collaborate to take down this network? Because it is still being used in 2024. It has only seen partial takedowns. Their methods are blunt. Their methods are quite visible once you know what they're doing. And yet we haven't had sort of a serious law enforcement effort to take this down. So how can we in the cybersecurity talk about this more? Or if you've seen this in new attacks, how can you make sure to include this in your reports so that people are appreciating the seriousness with which they do their work? And lots of sources. Just want to thank everyone who's published on Raspberry Robin. Our work wouldn't have been possible. All of the stuff we've been able to feed to law enforcement wouldn't have been possible without this. So big thanks to that. And just to wrap up, all those sort of details that I've included in the presentation, we have a free community platform. So feel free to go searching in there. You can get the IPs that we've seen for some of those domains and do your own hunts off it. So, and now I'll take any questions if anyone has any. Please.
Thank you. I kind of want to pick on one of your open questions at the end about them making changes as a threat actor group. You'd mentioned going from USBs to more common payloads, and then takedown requests from the FBI. They had obviously changed domain registrars. But really, the question is, what do you think it would take for an attacker to change their ways? You had mentioned early in the presentation that they're not incentivized to do so, and it's working very well. So what do you think it would take for an actor of this caliber to make changes like that, to severely change their process to make it more obfuscated or maybe a little more silent?
Yeah, I think based on what I've heard about people who have defended against them, there are signatures for the Raspberry Robin USB payloads. And so there's a variety of organizations who say, we found tens of thousands of our endpoints were at one point impacted by this. And they only know that because they detected it and stopped it. And so my guess is that around 2022, 2023, enough cybersecurity companies picked up that this was a threat, got working fingerprints for it, had it deployed in their endpoints, and they just saw a drop off of successful attacks. And if they're being paid for those follow-on payloads, and then they're not able to deploy those follow-on payloads, suddenly they're not making money. And so because they're initial access brokers and they're not doing the work themselves, it was probably an analytics decision where they just were seeing the drop off, not enough money from those follow-ons.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
So earlier in your presentation, one of the slides I noticed browser assistant was one of the things you poked at in there. Do you have any more information you can share on browser assistant? Do you know if any of the other odd browser tools like Wave browser or anything have similar activity?
I don't, and that's a really good question though. And it basically, some of those details made it more clear to me that it was a team-based approach, where it kind of felt like a Hail Mary, where I was like, why would you spend your time on that? But if you had, a dozen people working it, and one person was like, I think we're gonna get some success from malicious extensions, it's a good place to test it. And the reports from that were from a couple of years ago. It hasn't come up again. And so My feeling on it is Raspberry Robin tries everything. They're doing a whole bunch of really interesting and novel things. And so malicious extensions are a great idea for any threat actor. And so someone there was probably like, let's give it the old college try. And then it maybe just didn't work as well as they'd hoped. Thanks, everybody. We appreciate everyone's time. I'm around here for any questions.